Rain worried the canvas through the night, a soft impatient drumming that sounded like 1,000 small fingers asking entrance. The air smelled of wet horse, oiled leather, and the faint lie of boiled bandages. Where the candle guttered, the silk of the tent walls shivered with each gust. Beyond, the darkness was full of murmuring men, the quiver of hobbled mounts, the low talk and laughter that scouts carry to keep out the thought of knives. Robb Stark lay listening and counted those sounds the way a man counts his bones after a fall. Each sound meant life. Each life had followed him from green hills to charred halls and iron fords and would stop following when he stopped breathing. A king, they called him. Some mornings the word felt like new mail, beautiful and very heavy. Gray winds stirred near the crate that held wheat flour and salted beef. The wolf's eyes burned when the tent flap lifted. Cailin followed the scent of rain in, shaking it from her hood, her hair damp and dark as the pelt of a river otter. In the months since they marched, grief had hollowed and sharpened her like a blade left outside. She was watchful with all her grief, and her grief was a thing with many names. "You should be sleeping," she said softly. "I have slept." He had tried to, and woken as he always did, hands searching for a sword that wasn't beside him and the fresh ache across his ribs complaining. There was a girl, a softness, a weeping he had almost gone to. He closed his fingers and felt the cold bite of the oath he had carried since he was small enough to sleep on his father's knees and ask why men had to speak such heavy words and put chains on themselves. Then he had not understood. He did now. Caitlin's glance went to the bandage. Still bleeding? No, he sat. The movement drew a breath through his teeth before he could keep it in. "It's nothing. That's what your father said to me after the boar's head hunt, the year before we married. He came home with an arrow at the skin and called it nothing until I had to be the one to break it off." She was near him now, the smell of rain and wool. "And Jane. She saved me from rashness." He heard the words as if they had walked in a circle before coming out again. "She is a kind girl. I told her I am betrothed. I told her again. And then I told myself until I could hear the words louder than the pain." Caitlin's shoulders loosened. It was not a victory the size of a map, not a river or city, but he saw it touch her like a small warm candle set upon the night. "We need all the oaths we can hold," she said. "A girl's kindness will not knit this realm." He thought of his father at Winterfell, the quiet weight of his hand on a child's head, of a voice that did not lift because it did not need to. They had said the North was a hard country. Oaths were the way men broke up the hard ground for planting. Break enough and winter would grow there instead. "Send for Lord Walder," he said. "Tell him we'll keep the bridge and the bargain both." Cailin nodded once, compact as a salute, and turned. The flap moved, the rain came in and then was shut out again. Gray wind lifted his head. Robb reached down, raking his fingers through the thick pelt. "No more madness," he told the wolf or himself. "No more breaking for the sake of a warm word and an easy hour." They left the crag before sunset's bruise had left the clouds, all their banners wet and heavy, their victories packed into wagons like wheat. He remembered the girl standing beneath the arch, her face a pale, good thing. She would marry someone kind, he hoped. He hoped for kindness everywhere and could not find a place to put the hope that did not immediately fall through. The Westerlands were full of holes where hope went. When he rode, the rain made a river along his jaw, through the whiskers that had come in coarse and red as bracken. Gray wind moved beside the horse, so quiet that men forgot there was a wolf there until they saw teeth. The road turned gray and slick. The hoofbeats behind him spilled and sorted themselves into ranks. Steel side in leather, a patient sound. Somewhere a man sang a hunting rhyme to keep time. It thinned into the rain. At the Twins, the towers rose out of the wet the way old bones lift out of a grave after the earth has been taken away by years. The water swirled about the piers. He remembered crossing there once before, under his mother's hard, careful eyes, with promises tied to his name like bells. The bells had been quiet since. He wanted them to ring clean again. They raised their banners up and they waited. Gray wind paced. The bridge's gatehouse looked like a face that could not decide whether to laugh or spit. A horn called once, a lazy, boasting sound. Then Lord Walder's voice went threading into the clear. Not in truth his voice, but his herald's, until the old man chose to be delighted. Who stands there? Robb, son of Eddard, king in the north, lord of Winterfell. Oh him, which one of you is the real one? There were 3 of you, last I heard. Kings grow like weeds summer past. He closed his jaw upon the answer he wanted to give. The herald's voice was trebly with the memory of mockery. Walder was a miser with everything but his scorn. We sent a raven. We bring a bridegroom. A little laughter went clattering along the parapet. Bring him up, then, the herald cried. Mind your boots. It's a long way down. Inside, the great hall of the crossing smelled of onions and old rushes. The ceiling was a web of beams sunk with smoke. Walder Frye leaned on an arm carved with fighting stags and foxes and looked like a pile of sticks roped together and given life by spite. He had, Robb thought, all the eyes of his house at his shoulders. They flickered like minnows and were worth as much to him as gambled coin. So you've come to stick yourself into my family at last, Walder said. About time. I was beginning to think you preferred Western G. Earls who poured you wine and whispered in your ear when the pain got bad. Every man in the room shifted, some in anger, some in pity. Walder would count both as coin. Robb stepped forward until he could smell the wax burning on the old man's table. I came to keep the oath I swore. I should have ridden to you before any campaign. I did not. Take my apology with my oath, my lord. Walder blinked. And in that blink Robb saw how old some men's scorn could grow, and how it sheltered them from their own fear. You'll take one of mine. I will. I have 7 and 10 granddaughters, Walder said, as if this were a nation and not a confession. Some pretty, some not, all with legs. One sings like a kettle left on. One has a birthmark like a country's coast on her thigh. One cries if you look at her too hard. The gods help the man that marries her. The gods help us all, Cailin said, and her voice made even Walder's mouth consider gentleness. Rosalind Frye stood at the back, behind an ant named for an unpleasant fruit. Her hands neat as folded linen and her eyes large, as if she had gathered dark water from the green fork and put it into her head. She had a delicacy about her that put Robb in mind of winter's first ice. The kind that looks firm until you kneel and put your weight on it and it resists, surprising you with its strength. He thought of what it would be to do right by such eyes. He thought of his father's hand, and the heart tree's face watching snow fall into its mouth, and the way his sister used to laugh when she thought no one was nearby. I will take Rosalind, he said. Walder made a noise like a chair leg being dragged across stone. Rosalind is a sweet child. I know, Robb said. The words were said. On the morrow, with song and wine, and if not gladness then at least the neat facade of it, the marriage was done. Robb held the girl's fingers, light and tense. He said the words that would bind him and felt the old weight become a clean new one. In the bedding there was a bustle, a good-natured cruelty, men shouting to cover their fear of tenderness, women laughing to make the roughness gentler. Robb went with his wife through the noise and kept his hand firm without being cruel. Even Walder smiled behind his teeth, counting favors for later. They left bread under the bed for luck, a heel, rough as the land itself. When the last of the laughter had clattered down the stairs and away and the candles had bled to long thin tear lines, he told Rosalind that he would not be unkind. She told him with a small, brave voice that she would be better than kind. The rain had stopped outside. Somewhere in the towers, a dog barked and then dreamed whatever dogs dream when they have forgotten hunger for a night. Gray wind lay by the door and made a noise deep in his throat, something like satisfaction and warning in a single breath. In the morning, they were given ducks with apples inside them and onions roasted until they were sweet. Walder gave them a goblet of silver with 2 handles that he had never used because it reminded him of a woman who had slighted him 38 years ago. His sons looked at one another like men who have seen the walls they had rested against become the skin of an enemy. But Robb saw in some of them Elmar's thin, upright effort, Perwyn's careful courtesy, something like relief. The world was set back a finger width where it belonged. The ravens came as if the skies themselves had been unbolted. They came to the twins, to Riverrun, to any outstretched arm. Robb took them with the impatience of a man opening letters from the dead. One broke him when it landed. It spoke with Maester Luwin's hand, and then with no hand at all, because though the words were written, it was grief that wrote them. Winterfell burned. Theon Greyjoy had turned his cloak. The boys had been taken and displayed and had become rumors and then bones. Bran and Rickon, once at his back on ponies too clever to tire at the wrong time, were lines of ash traced upon an ash gate. He did not speak for a long time. Roslin's hand tightened and loosened on his sleeve without his noticing. Catelyn sat. Grey wind went and came again, like surf at a shore that has remembered the moon. When Robb found his voice, it did not come at first. It came in pieces and had to be gathered and bound into a single thing. "We go north," he said. "We go now. The Riverlands will hold for a season. The twins will hold. I will hold what is mine." "Moat Cailin," said the Blackfish. "The Iron Men have put their boot there. You can't get a horse's bridle through the neck while they sit smiling in those wet towers." "We won these men with our promises," Catelyn said. "We cannot throw them against stone and swamp for a rage." "I am not throwing anyone," Robb said. "I am going home." He called council to the East Tower, where the mortar had been repaired with clay and straw so recently that it smelled of the river. Lords whose words held secrets and sins set their hands upon that rough wall and left prints they could never remove. The great John banged his fist on the table until the apples jumped, then swore to eat his own beard if he didn't wade to Winterfell by way of the neck and drag 40 squids out by their faces. "Ed Howland Reed," Catelyn said. He name was a hand she had folded away years ago. "If anyone knows a path under the water, it's him." "Then we'll find him," Robb said. "Meej Galbart, you knew his halls once. Find them again. Tell him the North calls its small fierce friends." He did not write to Theon. He could not trust the words he would write. Later, when the anger had cooled into something that could be held without burning, he would decide whether he wanted Theon Greyjoy's head or his truth. For now, the name was a stone in the mouth. He did not spit, he did not swallow. They left the next morning, and the morning after that every morning felt like leaving something else behind. Roslin rode well and did not complain. He saw the change in his men when she gathered cloth and tucked it under her saddle and smiled at women who stared at her as if she were something fragile that had wandered into their hard country by mistake. She held her courtesy like a shield and a weapon both. Lord Walder grumbled about the dowry and then sent them a wagon of dried apples with a note that said he had not forgotten and never would, which was as near to a blessing as it got with him. Somewhere along the Green Fork, where willow roots tangled like old women's hair and herons pretended to be statues, the hound was taken. He came in at a trot with a girl behind him and a lie in his mouth about ransoms and debts. That was the story, but the true thing was the way the girl looked when she saw Robb and then his mother beyond him, the way something inside her startled with such force it shook her hands. Arya had a scab on her wrist and the sort of stillness that comes only when a child has learned to make herself invisible or die. Catelyn did not cry. She made no sound. She crossed the same distance that Walder had made them pay for, and it was nothing. A feather across a table. Her hands took Arya's face. Her mouth found the hair at her temple, the same hair she had had as a babe. She made a small noise then, like a bird that has flown into a room and is frightened it will never see the sky again and is suddenly out through the window. The hound stood with his ugly face sneering at the world and at himself for being there. He expected to be cut down for the Queen's slanders done, and the Queen's daughter offered. Instead, Robb gave him meat with grease running down his wrists and said he could leave with his story if he left the girl, or he could stay and earn bread with the hand that held the sword if he put it to the throats of men who had once called him Kennelman. The hound took the second offer because even truer dogs like to turn on old masters when they have been beaten enough. He ate with unashamed hunger and called his bread names and slept where gray wind would not let him turn in his sleep too suddenly. River birds had feathers like coins. They whirled and fell. News fell with them. Ravens told them that Stannis had spent his fire on Blackwater and had been drowned for it. The sea had not loved him. The Tyrell roses had unfurled in the heat of it all and come to sit at the king's table with their stems full of thorns. Robb's men cursed and spat when they heard. Some laughed because laughter had always been their shield. Robb did neither. He learned the shape of the new map the way he learned a woman's cheek with his palm, carefully and without haste. The city was not for him now. The neck was. They went into lands that hummed with fly and frog and quietly kept secrets. Spears grew out of the earth there, green and silent. They saw no man for days and then numbers of men all at once. Brown men with hair braided back and skin glossed with wet, who stood where you had not seen them and tipped their heads in greeting. Howland Reed was one of those men whose age was impossible to guess because the marsh had preserved him. His eyes were the color of leaf shadow on water and hard to look at for long. "You're taller than your father," he said. He would not like that. He liked almost nothing about growing old, Caitlin said, and the words were a relief. She could hold them in her hands and feel they were true and not have them break. "The neck keeps faith," Reed said. "No bolt or chain ever held us, but we are bound where we chose. We can make you a road. We can make your enemies bog down and eat reed mice until their teeth fall out." "What of Moat Cailin?" Robb asked. "Iron and stone in the marsh. Even stone rots, given long enough." Reed smiled, and his teeth were white in the green light. "Those towers have more ghosts than men. We'll feed the ghosts and starve the men. We'll come up under." He drew a map with a reed in a pan of water black as a mirror and moved it with his breath until Robb saw it. The channels, the old causeways half remembered by eels and herons, the cypress that had fallen and become a bridge for feet that knew where to find it. He saw the iron-born halls with their rough shields hung, and he saw how a man might walk to the very foot of them without being seen if he did not mind that the earth would try to swallow him 3 times before. They went like that night after night, tasting the marsh on their tongues. Men learned to move as if their bones were reeds and their thoughts were water. The first time Robb fell to his thigh, he laughed once and stopped before the sound traveled. Gray wind went before, the marsh accepting him the way it accepts things that grew there. Rosalind watched from the safety of a hummocked island with Caitlin and a cluster of spears and learned the flying of snipe and the way dragonflies are drawn to any brightness. When Robb came back to her with weed on his knees and he smelled of wet soil, she wiped his hands with her shawl and called it a queen's cloth, which made a few men forget their fear of the next day. On the 4th night, when a mist lay like an old wool blanket and iron-born voices carried on it better than they should, Reed's daughter moving like a water-inns. Isiti tugged Robb's sleeve and pointed. Between 2 dead trees lay a seam of dark where no mist clung. A man could crawl there as if into his own grave and come out the other side in another world. Robb went first. If he asked anyone else to go, then he must be willing. The earth came near, pressed his ribs, tasted of metal and rot. When he came up, the old causeway stones were under his palm and the ironborn's torch was close enough that he felt its heat waver on his cheek. They took the first tower without sound. The second required sound. A roar when a man slipped and rattled a shield and the crannogmen sang their thin, long song that made listeners unsure of themselves. Gray Wind's teeth did for a man who thought to make a trumpet of his shouting. The third tower gave them a moment when men died in a doorway and left different parts of themselves on different sides. Then the Ironborn ran because marshes are for running the wrong way in. By sunrise, the moat wore their banners. The wolf head hung black with dew. Reeds grew in one tower where a window had been left open for years and the wind had walked through until it forgot how to leave. Robb stood with his hands on the merlin, and Hawkeys below him cursed and tried to lift a stuck wheel that had been stuck for a generation. The neck had a road again, not one a cart could travel yet, but one that a king and 7,000 of his dearest could pick their way along if they knew where they were going. When the sun lifted as a pale coin and stamped the marsh with its light, a figure lurched out of the shadow of a cypress. 2 men fell upon it and had a knife at the throat before they realized that the man had an iron collar on and no shoes, and his hair was a story best not told. He said his name, and for a heartbeat no one knew it, and then all men in the world knew it. Some with anger, some with pity, some with the sort of slow smile men get when they think justice is a thing you can hold in your hand. "Theon," Robb said. He could not force the words out first try. He made them come by thinking of his father's face again. Release him. Bind his hands again when the maester has done. He is not going anywhere. Theon's mouth made a shape like a man trying to drink from a thorn. I came to tell you what you already know, he said, and then what you don't. He spoke of Ramsay Snow in a voice that expected no forgiveness for the telling. He described the fall of Winterfell as a man who had fallen himself and had never stopped falling. When he said that the bones they had hung weren't the bones men had thought, a murmur went moving through the men like the wind that runs ahead of rain. When he said Maester Luwin had died slow and kindly, Caitlyn's hands pressed against her mouth and she made no sound and then put her hands down, because a mother of kings must not press against a cry as if she were a girl. Robb placed both palms on the table, felt each scar there as if they were hills on a map. If Ramsay is at the dreadfort, he said, very level, then the dreadfort will have cause to open its gates at last. Roose Bolton's mouth was a small idea on his face. The bastard is no friend to sense. He'll light the north under you like straw. He already has, Robb said. He watched Bolton as if the man were a candle seen through water. Will you help me put him out? Bolton's eyes lowered and lifted and lowered again. One could mistrust that and be safe all one's life. One could choose trust and perhaps be a fool for a day instead of a lifetime. The dreadfort does not gut kings at their gate, Bolton murmured. We will stand as we ever have. Let's eat this victory before we spit the next meat. They ate. They spoke of carts and load-bearing timber, and which fords would admit a wagon that had not been lightened. They spoke of ghosts of the first men and of what iron rusted like when it had to stand in water for a century. Theon slept, or pretended to, and when he woke he said that he had no wish to live. That was a thing men said often after they had put their bodies to a work their souls could not carry. Robb told him if he were intent upon dying, he would consult after his usefulness had been spent, and that was the only mercy he had to give. Theon cried dry, rusted tears for a while, and then became silent as a piece of wood. On a day when the sun lit the marsh like molten tin, a raven struck the moat with a plain, square message. Joffrey Baratheon choked on his wedding wine. The city had a new boy in the chair. In the wake of that news rolled others like barrels. Tywin had been killed by his own son, a story such men always call impossible until they have seen a father die in an awkward place and a son walk away with a face like every judgment they have ever been guilty of. The realm tilted. The Tyrells smiled with more teeth than flowers. Cersei was a wheel that had spun loose of its axle. Men who had looked at each other over riverbanks began to do sums in their heads and taste a different kind of future than the one that had been set before them. Tywin was the spine of that beast, the Blackfish said. It can flop and bite still, but it won't stand the way it did. Good, said the Great John. Then we'll put it out of its misery, or it will become 3 beasts, Caitlyn said in her measuring way. And we must decide which one we can bear beside our door in winter. We go home first, Robb said again. We clean our hearth. Then we see which neighbor we can sit with without choosing poison. They marched up the green road that was not a road. The wind changed and smelled like pine pitch and the old cold of stone. He saw the first hills rise, the first familiar thrust of a land that had built his legs beneath him with snow and labor. When the burned shell of a holdfast came into sight and someone said the name of the man who'd held it until he was hamstrung and strung up, Robb's hand closed without his telling it to. The Dray. Adfort did not open its gates because it had never learned how to. It knew only how to show its skin and make other men's knuckles crack against it. Ramsay came out to meet them. A lurking smile smoothed over his face like bad butter over a piece of stale bread. He had taken to wearing red like a priest, and there were men around him who would have licked his fingers if he told them there was sugar there. He asked to parley. He asked to set terms as if he had a choice, which is the last dignity any desperate man will take even when his pockets are empty. Robb went down with a shield on his arm and men he trusted at his back. The winter wind tugged at the banners as if testing each knot. Ramsay had eyes like coins that had sunk to the bottom of a northerly stream and taken on the color of moss and slip. He smiled his smile. "Cousin," he said, his tongue savoring the lie, "I bring presents. I bring your castle, wrapped in ash and kindness. "You are a bastard," Robb said evenly. "I have no cousins that wear other men's faces." "You have my father, though," Ramsay said. "And he has you. Shall we see which of you values the other more?" The arrow whistled then, because Ramsay could not help himself and because some men must turn talk into blood to feel clever. It took the man on Robb's left through the meat of the shoulder. The Grachan's roar answered the way the bear answers a man with a stick. The shield wall moved. Gray wind flew. There are parley breaks and there are battles that happen because every man has kept a promise to the man next to him. This was the second kind. The dreadfort spewed men. Men who had played at cruelty so long they had forgotten why. Men who thought flaying was a kind of prayer. Men who wanted to see fear become steam on the cold air. The North met them. Robb's sword had a polite life of its own. The sort that went in and out where it was meant to and did no flourish but that which is necessary if one wishes to breathe again. When the clash had become a blur of breath and iron, Ramsay went backward under the weight of his guards, pulled in like a boy being taken from a feast he has made hateful. Bolton's banners hung undecided as a man's mouth. Then they tipped forward, graceful as a knife. "Hold," said Roose, voice cool as melted snow. And then, after an eternity that lasted until men remembered they had hearts, he said it again to a different group of men, and those went at the Dreadfort's men with a crisp method. Afterwards, men told stories of that moment, their private loves and hates folded into each telling like spice into dough, until it became many truths at once. What Robb knew was this: Roose came in when the numbers were counted. He took no joy in the blood that spattered his collar. He took no sorrow either. Robb would remember that until he died or lived so long that even keen things dulled. Ramsay vanished like a knife into a sleeve. Snares sprang in the woods afterward for days. Boys who had been given dead men's boots vanished with them. The Dreadfort would not accept a siege because it did not know how to say please or thank you. It knew how to outlast and be hateful. Winter was coming. Not the words, but the truth underneath them. Robb took his men away before he had to watch them make their beds in the skin of their enemies. That night, where the pines leaned like listening men and the snow ran thinly in stripes across the ground where the wind had laid it, Arya came with knives and a girl's terrible timing and asked if she might go kill a man. She said his name with such simplicity that the air seemed to open where it fell. Robb touched her hair in exactly the way he knew he shouldn't. "We have need of you," he told her. "Your mother has need. Don't spend yourself on that stub of anger. Keep it. We'll put it where it will do real work." "It will do real work right now," she said. She was all bones and hard sense. "Then save half," he said, and surprised himself with a smile that did not feel like something stolen. A new raven flew in, this one blown thin and wretched by the winds at the top of the world. The paper was made stiff by cold things. The words were John's and were not John's, the way a boy grows into a shape and his voice grows into his father and mother both. The walls of the world had been tested and were holding. There were giants somewhere in that black wind and men who had decided they were done with one kind of life and could not find the new kind yet. Stannis Baratheon had lit fires there and saved men who did not love him. And Jon had gone from watching to doing in the way that men do when no one else is there to do it. Robb kept the letter in his hand until its edges cut his skin a little. He bled in a very tidy way and folded the paper and put it in his pocket with the blood upon it because this too was a kind of oath. If the war had originally been a storm felt across the warm southlands, this was ice weather pressing its thumb on the roof. He could feel the weight of the thing that had been coming since they were all children, saying, "Winter is coming," and laughing a little to hear the words like a game. "Ride to White Harbor," he told his men the next day. "Tell Lord Manderley we're ready to pay for his ships by hauling them across land if we must. Tell him the North remembers and the king of it is bringing that memory home." Lord Manderley sent back pies that would feed a squad on a day's march and timber and men with hands as clever as money. He sent, too, a message quiet as a good knife slid under a letter seal, that he had friends on the Sisters, that the tides were with him, that so many gulls had fallen upon the docks in White Harbor this last week that it felt like a good omen, because the sea sometimes went mad with fish and gifts. He wrote that if the Freys were in truth their friends now, Then he would find out whether friendship held long enough to be used. And he wrote that if they were not and there were ways to make dough rise without wheat. They followed the road of their own, making through the neck, and then they followed no road at all, only a series of known places that led to a place none of them had seen ruined. Winterfell's walls rose out of the snow black as old hands. Between the fingers of those hands, someone had made a little garden of char. The heart tree still stood, red leaves whining in the wind, the mouth in its pale trunk remembering things it had watched and not judged. In the great keep, soot turned to paste where melted snow found it. The sky looked down through holes a man could have thrown a stone through and not heard it land for a full count of 30. Robb walked through the place his childhood had left and did not let himself look away from the places that hurt. In the kitchen, a burned pot still leaned against another like a woman sobbing on someone's shoulder. In the armory, a boy's carved wooden sword lay flaked with black. He knelt and picked it up and blew, and the ash went away, and the sword was what it had ever been, rough and too light to hurt anyone. Rosalind found him there. She had learned how to step quietly without trying, as if the place itself asked her to. "You're home," she said. "Our home," he answered. He had not meant to. It came like a breath he had been holding since he married her before a crowd who watched like ravens. She looked at him with the kind of attention that felt like drink. They set to it then, in the way that men set shoulders under a beam. They did not pretend it would be done in a day or a season. They set boys to haul and men to lift and women to command, both in the way that makes a keep again. They lit fire and they lifted out the dead not yet found, and they gave them to the ground and the names to the air. When the first room was made fit to sleep in, Cailin set fresh rushes on the floor and made a bed with her own hands, because sometimes a queen must show where she wants the work to go by doing it herself. The gods would watch them all. When Robb went there at dusk, the snow fell with more ceremony, as if it were thoughtful. He stood looking at the face in the tree. He had seen terrible faces. Men's faces when they bleed out slowly, women who had emptied themselves of grief and would spend the rest of their lives filling again. This face was none of those. Simply watched. When he spoke, the words sounded different in the red leaves. "Father," he said, "old habit, old comfort. I kept my vow. I did not break them to buy a day of warmth. I lost other things. I will lose more, but I kept that." Then, because there was no song to sing to make the request smaller, he asked for help. Not from gods he had never met, but from the trees his father had stood under, because the tree had stood longer than any of them and might keep standing if someone asked right. Snow set a cold line down his spine, and he felt it with a kind of gratitude that surprised him. When he opened his eyes, gray wind was staring into the mouth in the tree, as if there were a wolf in the wood of it somewhere that only wolves could see. Winter fell proper over the next weeks, a steady accumulation of weight. Ravens flew less. Men moved with more thought. In the hall, men ate stew and told stories as if those stories were stones in the walls they needed stronger. The hound sat with his back in a corner and called men fools when they were sentimental, and let a small boy fold his hand into the thick of his hair without biting him for it. Arya went out into the yard and beat a man twice her weight at a game of sticks until her stick broke, and she laughed with an unlovely sound that made Robb love her more, because he wanted her to be made of iron and he wanted her to be his wild little sister both. And that was not possible, and yet there she stood, both. The Ironborn left Moat Cailin in the end, not because Robb drove them out, but because their new king had as many mouths to feed as he had men, and the Winter Sea has no patience with boys' plans. Some drowned with their boots off. Some changed their names and ate snowberries until they learned the taste of them the way they had once known salt. Asha Greyjoy sent a letter with words like "weapons you sharpen with your tongue" that said she had never wanted Winterfell, only freedom, and that she had learned too late the difference between the two. From the wall came news that smelled of pine resin and desperation both. Stannis had saved them and had also made the saving a ledger, measuring men in victories, adding them up, subtracting. He had come into the true north, into lands where a man's claim must be argued with weather. He had lost his shape and then found a harder one. There are men who grow holy in winter because the world itself becomes a sort of sermon. Stannis was not one of those. He was a rule set upon a field of chaos, and sometimes chaos is angered by rules. Jon's letter asked for grain, for meat, for men who could shoot and stand. It asked for a king's word and a brother's. Robb answered with both. He said yes with the grain they had saved by not eating seconds. He said yes with men who were not too old and not too young and not so full of hate they could not tell the difference between a wildling and something else. He told Jon that he had named him once and did not take back names lightly. He told him that if he was still of the Night's Watch, he would never ask him to come south as anything else. He sealed the letter with a wolf made of tallow set with a knife's tip into wax, and he sent it with a man who had never lost a bird. On the day they set the last new beam across the great hall in such a way that it could be counted as a beginning, Rosalind took his hand in the shadow of the hall's door and told him that she had not bled. She was calmer than he was. Men came and went with news, each wrapped in its own frost and breath. In the yard, Grey Wind chased 2 dogs once and then let them chase him twice, in the way of wolves when they choose small kindnesses. When the brace was in, the men cheered as if a wall held back the sea and not the wind. War sends messengers in the shape of men and also in the shape of rumors. There came a rumor that Roose Bolton had met with a man in a half-burned village and changed 2 words that had changed other words that had changed how men died. There came a rumor that he had married a fry under a willow out of sight of the gods to buy coin, and that he had bought it too dear. There came a rumor that the Lannisters had offered him a cloak for the north if he would seek a way to put it about his shoulders by killing a boy he had once called Lord. Robb did not chase rumors the way dogs chase hares. He put a weight on each and let them lie until the snow pressed them and they were a shape instead of a sound. One night, when the aurora walked faint and green across the sky as if the gods had dragged a sleeve through the stars, a rider came hard from the east with a letter bound to his arm because he had lost the bag and did not care. He threw himself off the horse and his breath steamed like a kettle shaken. He stood in the great hall and read because his hands could not uncurl from the reins. His voice was hoarse with days of work. Lord Bolton, he read, has been waylaid near the Weeping Water by someone who wanted the letters he was carrying. He swallowed. His throat made a sound. The someone had a bastard's laugh. The letter went on. It was marked with the small, clean lines of a maester who had spent too long making himself small. Names were there, dates, a price set upon Winterfell like it were a cow with good fat. There were red drops on the paper that had dried brown. Robb sat very straight. He did not look to see who in the hall would have his eyes on him. There was nothing there for him even if he saw. He looked at Grey Wind, and Grey Wind looked at him as if he knew the word that was about to be said and had known it a long time. Bring him, Robb said. Bring Roose. Bring him into the light and let him tell us which road he is on. The north is a place where truth is not the same as law because both must manage to live in the cold. When Roose stood there, very clean and very composed, he did not look like a man who had ever laughed. He made a long line with his mouth and said that letters could be forged. He said that bastards were fond of mischief. He said that men had always lain about him because they feared him and he had learned not to mind. Why should we believe this lie over yours? Robb asked. Because it is uglier, Caitlin said very quietly. And uglier things grow well in winter. Roose's eyes flickered. It was as near to human a sign as they ever made. The north does not need me if it has you, he said. What it needs is small and hard. What it needs is fewer words. It would have been easy in a hall full of men and food and fire to kill him then. Men desire easy things most just when they have been told they cannot have them. Robb did not. He set a guard on Roose that was 2 men slow to anger and 1 quick, not for Roose but for themselves. He told Arya that she could not stab him in the night, and she did not say that she had not thought to. In the morning, Roose was gone, and whether he had been let out or had unmade a lock with an old silence that he had rolled under his tongue, no one could say. On the south road there were prints that would not last the day. If the north was to be rid of Roose, it would not be done by a court. It would be done by weather and chance and by some man or woman whose name would not be remembered in the songs because some work is too ugly to sing. He let it go. The knowing of Roose in the world was a kind of winter that would not be stopped by a hand at its throat. He had other winters to deal with. When spring put its fool's gold light on the snow for a week and the icicles sang at noon, a bark pulled up at White Knife and from it stepped a maester from the vale with a mouth full of cautious words. He said that the Lady Lisa had flown. He said that she had fallen. He said that Sansa was gone with the wind and with a man who had always been the wind anyway. He said that the Eyrie was locked, its goats more determined than its lords. He said anything that the air might carry and the snow might hide. Robb did not decide to ride east. He decided to hold north. He put his name on the things he could touch. He learned the names of men who led 10 other men and knew which of those names would keep those 10 alive. He learned what parts of Winterfell were sound and what parts would have to wait a year. He learned the way Roslin's shoulder sat under his hand when she slept and the way she set her mouth when she pretended not to be afraid. He learned new ways to speak to Arya that did not draw blood every time and new ways to let his mother go away and come back as she needed to without making it into a state matter. When the first true thaw came, thick and sudden, a line of dark men marched into the yard under a banner painted with a deer that had learned to be a weapon. Stannis Baratheon came like a rock that had learned to walk, hard and determined to continue. His face had all the lines of a man who had not smiled in a decade because he had other uses for his mouth. A red woman came with him and looked at everything and said nothing at all, which is a form of arrogance more impressive than any. They spoke under the holes that had not yet been plastered over in the great keep and through which the sky showed itself in long, bright wounds. "You call yourself king," Stannis said, looking at Robb's collar as if words might be written on it. "You will stop." "I have no quarrel with you, my lord," Robb said, as if both of them had not already made quarrel into employment. "The wall stands because of you. The north stands because of us. We can do both a sare. Vice if we do not cut at each other for the pleasure of it." "I do nothing for pleasure," Stannis said. A corner of his mouth twitched, which might have been humor if it had not been pain. "I do what is right. Boys play at kings. Men do their duty." "Duty is a word that eats," Robb said, and felt his father's hand on his shoulder again. "I have learned that. It does not change that I cannot kneel to a man who could not keep my sister safe in the city where his law says he is strongest. If you want me to bend, you must show me a law I trust more than the ones my father taught me in the Godswood." The red woman watched them as if she could see the lines of heat in each of them, where each was willing to burn and where each would turn to ash. They stopped speaking at last, not because they had made a bargain, but because their words were stones and they had thrown enough for a day. Stannis asked for men. Robb gave him some with the same care he had given Jon. He expected none back. He asked for grain. Robb gave it because there were worse things than a hungry king in winter. There were the dead, and then the not quite dead, and all the names for what the snows carry down from the woods when it has been too quiet for too long. Later, when the torches had been pushed into their black iron rings and the day's cold had become night's cold, Roslin came and put Robb's hand flat on her belly. It was a thing that men always misunderstand and always understand at once. She was new there and very old at once, as if this were not the first of the world's children and would nevertheless remake the world. He watched her face and saw the terror and the light jump together and knew he had done a thing that would bind and bind and bind until the rope wore through his hands. He found he did not mind his palms being cut. In the Godswood, the face in the tree watched again while he told it that he would be careful with this gift. The snow fell as if to say that carefulness and love are not the same and that both are needed. When dawn came, the sun rose thin as health after illness. Men shouted in the yard over nothing and everything. The hound taught a boy to hold his shield like he meant it and cursed like a prayer. Arya raced a girl who had once been a baker's daughter around the broken well and laughed once, a real laugh, before she caught herself and swallowed it because too much laughing makes men think you are weak. Caitlin stood at the top of the newly set stair and held the banister and looked down at the hall as if she was counting all the mouths again and smiled toward something that was not here and never would be again. Grey Wind went and came and put his head under Robb's hand without asking. Outside the walls, the winter was waiting. It was patient, which is a form of ferocity. It would take men and give them back as stories and names, and some would be lost and some would be found. Robb stood on the battlements with his hair full of snow and his breath steadying. He knew what would come, war again, because men are the sort of beasts that cannot stop tearing at each other even when the cold is at their feet. He knew the Lannisters would not forget how to hate because they had tried. He knew Roose Bolton would write the North's name inside his mouth and test it and keep it like a forbidden sweet until it had rotted his teeth. He knew he would send letters to White Harbor, to the sisters, to the mountain clans who had always been too proud to have lords, to the crannogmen whose houses could move when the waters asked them to. He knew he would search the road to the Vale for a girl with hair like sunlit chestnut who had not asked to be bartered and had learned how barter worked anyway. He knew he would set a chair in the hall for Bran and another smaller one for Rickon because hope is a sort of stubbornness and he was an excellent northerner. But for the length of a breath, for the pause the world gives even men who have made themselves into their work. He was simply a boy of Winterfell again with the wind pouring through him like cold wine, and the land that had made him was beneath him, and the tree that had watched his father was watching him and would watch whatever came next, and the wolf was at his side, and his wife's hand would reach for his in the night and he would take it, and his mother would sit and sew and forget and remember and forget again, and his sister would choose which name to use in the morning. And beyond all of it, beyond even the cold and the men who thought they were kings and the women who knew they were queens, the first birds of a spring that would come in 1 year or 2 or 10 flew in a ragged line, foolish and brave, toward whatever warmth was next.